a brilliant scientist named Dr. Jim Beale, together with his two colleagues Chuck and Matty, is conducting a major experiment, activating a machine designed to open a wormhole, which they call the gyroscopic quantum generator. To power it up, the machine requires a main energy source called MRD, which functions to stabilize the magnetic field inside the machine and acts as a quantum time marker to ensure that the time coordinates within the wormhole remain aligned with both the present and the future. In other words, the MRD is essentially the heart of Jim's time machine. The purpose of this experiment is to prove that two identical particles, or even the same object, can exist at two different points in time, demonstrating the concept of time travel itself. Unfortunately, they failed to start the machine simply because Matty mixed up left and right. Despite being one of the few individuals in the world capable of solving the most complex mathematical equations, Matty still suffers from dyscalculia, a specific learning disorder that affects a person's ability to understand and process mathematical concepts and calculations, showing that no matter how intelligent someone may be, they can still struggle with it. At the same moment, a capitalist businessman named Klaus Meissner arrives to check on the project he has funded. Meissner is the CEO of Klaus Meissner Corporation, the only company capable of manufacturing the extremely rare and expensive MRD components. Since there is only one MRD left, Jim is determined not to fail the second test. Otherwise, Meissner might refuse to make another MRD for him. Finally, the machine is successfully activated. When the wormhole begins to open, a massive reaction occurs, producing a swirling vortex of bright white energy. They throw a dahlia flower into the wormhole as a test object. The flower disappears. Suddenly, Jim collapses, unable to withstand the intense brightness of the energy vortex. After regaining consciousness, Jim tells Chuck that just before he fainted, he saw the shadow of a human figure emerging from the wormhole, suggesting a potential leak in the actual timeline. And shortly afterward, an identical dahlia emerges from the wormhole, indicating that the machine is connected to the future. Jim rushes outside to look for the figure and encounters a woman named Abby who is casually smoking. Jim asks where she came from, but she responds by asking how Jim managed to do it, an odd question for the situation. Meanwhile, Meissner is seen leaving the lab, disappointed by what he believes to be Jim's failure. Jim approaches him and asks for more time. At first, Meissner ignores him, but when he notices Abby standing beside Jim, he invites both Jim and Abby to dinner with his wife to discuss the project further. Before leaving, Jim instructs Chuck and Matty to analyze the dahlia flower that emerged from the time machine. At a restaurant, Jim explains that the project did not fail as Meissner thought. The machine successfully opened a wormhole, a tunnel that serves as a shortcut between 2 points in space and time separated by light years. To travel through this tunnel, there must be 2 openings on each side, one entrance and one exit. Jim has already managed to open one side, proven by the dahlia flower that emerged from the machine. However, to prove that the machine functions perfectly, Jim needs to redo the experiment by sending the flower to the other side. For that reason, Jim hopes Meissner will provide additional MRD units so the experiment can continue. Instead, Meissner suggests that Jim sell the patent rights of the project to him. That way, Jim wouldn't have to worry about finding sponsors and could continue his research under Meissner's employment. After all, Meissner and his wife expect great profit from this project. Jim, of course, refuses the offer. For him, this research is not about money. It is about humankind's efforts to answer fundamental questions about the universe. Abby then gives an example of 2 pioneers of electricity, Nikola Tesla and Thomas Alva Edison. When developing electrical power, Tesla worked tirelessly to make electricity available to everyone, safe, free, and unlimited, making him seen as someone who wanted to improve the world. Edison, on the other hand, used his fame and influence to discredit and even destroy Tesla's reputation. At that time, Edison's company bought the patents for an inefficient electrical system that required people to pay for electricity every month. If Abby had to choose, she would risk everything for Jim so he could change the world with his research. Unexpectedly, Abby's words impressed the Meissner couple. Eventually, Meisner agrees to provide additional MRD units on the condition that he owns half of the machine. Jim agrees, but insists on giving Meisner only 49% ownership. Jim then thanks Abby, the woman who saved his research. But the real question is, who is she really, and could she be from the future? Because it seems that Abby already knows him and knows a great deal about his project. Abby responds no. She has heard many stories about Jim from Meisner, and now she is simply interested in learning more about his personality. The two of them return to Abby's apartment to spend time together. By accident, Jim notices a dahlia flower among Abby's collection. Strangely, the flower has the code KMC14, the exact same number as the dahlia used in the experiment. Jim asks where she got it, but Abby refuses to answer and instead hugs him. At the same moment, Matty calls and asks Jim strange questions, such as where they first met and how long they have worked together. Questions that, luckily, Jim can still answer. Matty then says that they have discovered something much bigger than they expected and warns Jim not to tell Abby anything about the experiment, fearing that Abby might be a spy working for Meisner. Because Jim trusts his two colleagues more, he decides to leave Abby abruptly. When Jim arrives at the lab, Chuck asks why he is there. Jim replies that he came to ask about the bigger discovery and about the warning to stay away from Abby. Suddenly, Jim suffers from a severe headache. A loud noise fills his mind before he collapses and passes out. When he wakes up, Jim asks how long he was unconscious. Matty tells him it has been about 11 hours since they sent the dahlia KMC14, which immediately reminds Jim that Abby possesses a dahlia with the same code number. Without Jim knowing, Matty secretly finds a small notebook in Jim's coat pocket and keeps it. Jim then heads to Abby's apartment to find out where she got the flower. When he arrives, he uses the intercom to call her room, but strangely, the communication becomes distorted. Then, a man inside the room says that Abby isn't there. Moments later, Abby suddenly appears behind Jim, holding 2 cups of coffee. Jim asks if someone is in her apartment, but Abby says no, and explains that Jim must have called her neighbor's room by mistake. The two of them then go to a bar. Jim asks Abby to tell him the truth about where she got the dahlia. The dahlia is extremely rare and expensive, not just anyone can own one, and the fact that the flower has the exact same number as the one used in his time machine experiment makes Jim believe that Abby is hiding something from him. Abby responds that perhaps the matching number is just a coincidence. Even Einstein once said that coincidence is one of the ways God remains anonymous. She explains that the flower was a special gift from someone who gave her everything except 1 minute of his time. And long story short, instead of discussing the origin of the flower, the two end up falling asleep together in her room until morning. The next morning, while Abby is still fast asleep, Jim secretly takes her dahlia flower and leaves the apartment. Downstairs, he meets Chuck, who has been looking for him since yesterday. But unexpectedly, Jim sees Meisner and his men arriving at Abby's apartment for unknown reasons. After receiving the MRD units Meisner promised, Jim proceeds with the third experiment. However, the electrical voltage suddenly drops, forcing Jim to postpone the test. While waiting for the power to stabilize, Jim spends more time with Abby. Back at the lab, Matty informs them that both dahlia flowers have identical DNA, which means they are the same object, either from the future within the same timeline or possibly from an alternate timeline, a parallel universe. Regardless of the theory, there is another important fact Jim must know. The flower is labeled KMC, which stands for Klaus Meisner Corporation. Meisner has long been trying to obtain the licensing rights for that rare exotic plant. Sure enough, Meisner suddenly requests a meeting to inform Jim that his company is now the legal owner of the licensing rights to the rare dahlia flower. Second, as the owner of 49% of the time machine, Meisner has the right to demand proof that the machine successfully sent the dahlia to the other side, which means if Jim uses the dahlia flower in his experiment, he must pay royalties that have already been set. However, because today Meisner claims to be in a generous mood, he offers a trade. Jim may keep the flower in exchange for 50% of Jim's ownership, which would leave Meisner with 99% ownership of the machine and leave only 1% for Jim. Even so, Jim would still be allowed to continue the project as Meisner's subordinate. And as Meisner explains, all these ideas came to him right after hearing the story of Tesla and Edison. Meisner says he will allow Jim to become the Nikola Tesla of this century, but he is more than happy to play the crooked Thomas Edison. So although Meisner is deceitful and greedy, he must be acknowledged as brilliant at creating one thing: victory. Business is indeed cruel, and if a competitor begins to drown, Meisner will personally force a hose into their mouth. Once again, Jim suffers a severe headache. A loud buzzing overwhelms his nervous system and only stops when he arrives home. What Meisner said has left Jim with no choice. Without MRD, he cannot continue the experiment. Even if Meisner gives it to him, Jim would have to use the Dahlia to prove the machine works, and doing so would mean handing over the machine to Meisner anyway. Whether he continues or quits, Jim loses the machine. Jim begins to suspect that Abby is the person behind Meisner's deception. Yet despite this, he decides to continue the experiment and intends to return Abby's Dahlia as a sign of his disappointment. When he arrives at her apartment, Jim hears Abby speaking with another man. Jim asks who is inside her room, but Abby refuses to answer, which hurts Jim even more, and he accuses Abby of playing with him. Long story short, Meisner and Abby arrive the next day to deliver the Dahlia flower that will be sent to the other side of the wormhole. As Jim brings the flower to the machine, Abby thanks him for spending the past few days with her. Unexpectedly, when the time machine is activated successfully, Jim enters the time portal, and the machine sends him back to the past, to the moment when Jim first met Abby. We see Abby just stepping out of a car right after Meisner finishes witnessing Jim's experiment. Jim approaches her, helps her light her cigarette and hands her his lighter. Jim then warns Abby that her actions, and Meisner's, have gone too far, which leaves Abby confused because this is actually the first time she has ever met Jim. Suddenly, Jim experiences another intense headache and walks away abruptly. Moments later, another Jim emerges from the lab and approaches Abby, assuming she has just come out of the time machine. This confuses Abby even more. She just watched Jim leave, and suddenly another Jim appears behind her. What shocks her is that this Jim seems to have never met her before. So the Jim who met Abby earlier is future Jim, the version of Jim whose love was betrayed and whose work was sabotaged by Meisner. Meanwhile, the Jim who is with Abby now is the real Jim, the one from the original timeline. In other words, the figure Jim saw after the first experiment was not Abby, but future Jim, who intentionally entered the time machine during the final experiment. But the question is, what caused future Jim to be transported to this specific moment in the past rather than somewhere random in time? Most likely when Jim activated the time machine in the third experiment in the future, the machine resonated with the one in the past that was also activated during the first experiment, forming a portal that connected the future and the past. Future Jim then entered the portal, shocking Chuck and Matty because the original Jim had just left to have dinner with Meisner. At first, Chuck and Matty don't believe him when he says he is from the future, specifically about 1 week ahead. But when Jim asks Chuck to call his present self, who is currently with Abby, they are stunned when the call confirms his story. Future Jim then asks Chuck to tell his present self not to tell Abby anything about the research. And if his prediction is correct, the real Jim will arrive shortly. This makes Chuck and Matty nervous. His presence could potentially disrupt reality, but future Jim explains that he came to the past to stop Meisner from taking control of the time machine. When the real Jim arrives and demands to know why he must stay away from Abby, he suddenly has a severe headache and collapses. Meanwhile, future Jim uses this moment to go and find Abby, to apologize for leaving her so abruptly. When they arrived, Abby asked Jim to wait while she took a shower. On the table, Jim accidentally found a small notebook containing detailed notes about the design of his time machine. But before he could ask anything, Abby hugged him and fell asleep until morning. The next morning, Jim was awakened by someone calling the room. It was the real Jim. So this is what actually happened when the real Jim thought he heard someone inside Abby's room through the intercom. It was actually himself from the future. Shortly after, Abby appeared carrying 2 cups of coffee meant for the future Jim in her room. From that incident, Abby should have realized that there were 2 Jims in the same timeline, the one in her room and the one she spoke with at the bar. But for some reason, she didn't tell the real Jim the truth and instead lied, saying that Jim had just called his neighbor and invited her for a drink at a bar, even though Jim wasn't a drinker. So, based on the sequence of events, after spending the night with the future Jim, it was the real Jim's turn to spend the afternoon with Abby. Meanwhile, in the room, the future Jim found a small note Abby wrote when they talked at the bar. Curious about what she had written, Jim went to the bar and secretly looked at Abby's notes, discovering a sentence: "Time is something very precious to humans," without realizing that the bartender was confused why 2 identical men were in the same place. After that, the future Jim hid in the apartment room next door to watch himself, who had just finished talking to Abby. Shortly after, Chuck came to see Jim to warn him not to worry about the woman, because Jim would never be able to change the past. But Jim didn't care, because the only way to fix his past was by controlling his future. He believed that Abby might have been ordered by Meisner to exploit the real Jim and put him in this situation. And because of her, Jim lost his entire research. Moments after the real Jim left carrying Abby's dahlias, the future Jim confronted Abby again, demanding her to be honest about her involvement with Meisner in trying to take over the time machine. But at that very moment, Meisner knocked on the door. Jim grew angrier and told Abby to meet him and assure him that everything was going according to plan. However, instead of meeting him, Abby told Meisner to come another time because Jim was with her. She then explained that her relationship with Meisner was personal and something she deliberately maintained in order to fund her research for the past 2 years, not to spy on Jim. Everything she did was documented in her small diary, which she then handed to Jim. In the diary, Abby explained that about 2 years ago, she worked at a secret laboratory out of town after hearing news that a physicist named John Bell had created a time travel machine. Until one day, Abby met John in front of his lab, who turned out to be Jim himself. From that moment, Abby knew the time machine worked and began building relationships with the 2 different Jims while writing down everything they said about the research. When Jim began to misunderstand and accused her of conspiring with Meisner, Abby started to wonder whether she could possibly have a future with Jim, which instantly made Jim realize that Abby had done everything out of love for him. But he understood that no one could change a fate that had already been determined. After learning the truth, Jim said that whatever happens next depends on him. If he could travel through time, then he could change what has already happened. But suddenly, the future Jim felt that something was wrong with his body. At the same time, the real Jim had just returned to the lab after meeting Meisner, also suffering from a severe headache. Right after that, Abby asked Chuck to come to her apartment to explain what was actually happening to Jim's body. When he arrived, Chuck showed a dahlia flower that had come from the time machine, or more precisely, a flower that appeared at the same time the future Jim arrived. The only problem was that when the flower appeared, they had no idea that Jim had also come through the machine. From that moment on, the flower slowly began to wilt and turn black, unlike the flower they already had, which remained fresh until now. It was the same with Jim's body, which was now beginning to weaken. There was a possibility that Jim was experiencing temporal side effects, a backlash caused by the future Jim existing outside of his original timeline. And based on the theory found in the notebook Matty discovered in Jim's pocket, 2 entities with the same consciousness cannot exist in the same timeline. In simple terms, there cannot be 2 Jims in one reality. That is how nature corrects an anomaly. What was happening to Jim's body mirrored the condition of the flower, and it was estimated that both Jim and the flower would only survive for the next 48 hours. Soon after, the real Jim came knocking on Abby's door to return the dahlia. By now, ownership rights to the flower had already been claimed by Meisner. This scene answers the mystery of who was actually inside Abby's room, the reason the real Jim became overwhelmed with jealousy and accused Abby of playing with his feelings. Frustrated by Jim's accusations, Abby told both Jim and Chuck to leave. although the future Jim tried to explain that the things Jim said at the time were only because he did not yet know the truth. Chuck then took Jim home to receive treatment. Once he recovered, the three physicists began searching for a solution to the overlapping reality so they could save the future Jim's life. Matty then presented Abby's notebook, which he found in Jim's jacket pocket. Written inside was the idea that if Jim went to a parallel world where no other Jim existed, his life could be saved. But Jim dismissed the idea as nothing more than a fairy tale that had no scientific foundation. The only way, he insisted, was to activate the machine and return to the future, then ask the two of them to prepare the time machine. After that, Chuck and Matty took the future Jim back to the lab to send him home. But when they arrived, the real Jim was already preparing for an experiment. Because of this, Chuck deliberately sabotaged the power supply so Jim would postpone the test. Once the real Jim left the room, Chuck activated the time machine to send the future Jim back. Unfortunately, Matty once again failed to follow the instructions correctly. Jim could not return to the future, and now they were completely out of MRD. That night, Chuck brought Jim to meet Abby to explain the real reason he traveled through time. At first, Jim only wanted to stop Meisner from gaining control of the time machine and to prove Abby's involvement. But the journey instead led him to the truth that Abby had never sided with Meisner. However, by then it was too late. The MRD was gone, and his body was rapidly deteriorating. Abby then told Jim that she had a solution to obtain more MRD. She would lure Meisner into giving it to her. Jim refused immediately. He couldn't accept Abby lowering herself just to save him, and insisted he would find another way. That same night, Jim went to Meisner's corporate facility intending to steal MRD from storage, but instead he discovered his own body lying lifeless inside a locked room. This discovery convinced Jim that Matty's theory about parallel worlds was true. Every time travel event did not actually send someone into the past of their original universe. Rather, it shifted them into a parallel world created as a side effect of the time travel itself. And that was why Abby knew Jim Bell as John Bell, because they had been together before, just in another version of reality. In Abby's journal, John Bell realized that his time travel always led him to parallel worlds with similar timelines, yet he never recognized the small differences. Jim then returned to Abby's apartment to watch her, only to discover that Abby ignored his warning and chose to seduce Meisner to obtain MRD and the Dahlia. After securing the components, Abby saw Jim watching her through the window of the neighboring apartment and understood that Jim knew everything she had done. A few hours later, Abby and Meisner arrived at the lab with MRD and the Dahlia so that Jim could redo the experiment. When handing the flower to him, Abby said that even though their time together was brief, she was grateful Jim had chosen to stay with her. At that moment, Abby already knew that when Jim activated the time machine, he would travel back to the past, which meant that only one Jim would remain in this reality, the real Jim currently lying weak in her apartment. In that case, his life should have been saved. But tragically, Abby came too late. Jim had already died. The scene then shifts back to the moment when Jim first emerged from the time machine and met Abby for the very first time, indirectly proving that Jim was trapped inside a time loop of his own creation, one with infinite possibilities. What happened to Jim afterward was a series of overlapping events throughout the film involving both the future Jim and the original Jim. Meanwhile, Abby in each repeated event was always the same Abby, meaning that within this time loop paradox, she was the fixed point, permanently connected to every version of Jim across every reality. After the future Jim died, Abby returned to the lab and met yet another future Jim who had just stepped out of the time machine. Moments later, she encountered the original Jim, who had run outside chasing the mysterious figure. What Abby experienced confirmed that she too was trapped in the loop created by Jim. That is why she was able to compile a journal containing detailed notes about the time machine mechanism, notes collected across each repetition of the loop. At the end of his life, Jim finally found his true love, yet lost his sense of direction between reality and illusion. Everything that happened to him was simply perfect synchronization between cause and effect, without a beginning or an end, where events in the future caused events in the past, which then caused events in the future, continuing indefinitely without a clear point of origin. The film closes with a scene showing the very first meeting between Jim and Abby in a cafe. Jim, who originally was not a drinker, offers Abby a glass of alcohol. Abby, busy writing in her notebook, tells him that she's not in the mood to meet anyone. Jim then asks if she recognizes him. Abby says no, but adds that he looks very much like a physicist named John Bell, the inventor of a time machine who died in an explosion at his lab. And tragically, at the moment when humanity was closest to controlling time, all of John Bell's research perished in that explosion. Jim admits that he is also a physicist and that he has recently been developing a time machine of his own. According to him, time is the greatest teacher, yet ultimately it kills all of its students. If Abby was interested, Jim would be willing to tell her about the time travel experiment he conducted, an experiment he believes would make a much better story. They exchange a gentle smile, and the film ends. There is a possibility that the Jim in this reality has already found a way to break the time loop he was trapped in, thanks to the notes Abby wrote while Jim was repeatedly reliving his fate. It's not impossible that Jim and Abby discovered new fragments of clues in every iteration of the events, and this is how the universe corrects itself. Additionally, the physicist John Bell, who died in the lab explosion, is none other than the Jim Bell of this reality. This means that if a reality contains only one Jim, then his body will not deteriorate from temporal effects. Furthermore, the fact that the deceased physicist was named John Bell reinforces the idea that the Jim we follow in the story does not come from Abby's timeline but from an alternate universe. And each time Jim travels through time, he actually creates a new parallel world. Therefore, the Jim who arrived in Abby's universe came from an entirely different reality. The film does not explicitly state what ultimately happens to them because the ending is intentionally left open, allowing viewers to interpret what might come next. And that's it for the story series of this film. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to support this channel by subscribe, like and share. See you in the next video. Goodbye.